We underestimated the whole thing, the height, the difficulties, the snows, the storms, the difficulty to find a bivouac place, for instance. You know, we had given us a promise, Kasperek and myself, never to climb during the afternoon. And you English have a wonderful saying, have a plan and stick to it. And we did stick to that plan. We were at the beginning of the second ice field at 2 in the afternoon, but we started bivouacking because in the afternoon it's hell on the second ice field and you hardly can avoid to get hit by a stone.
At midday on the 22nd, they rested together at Death Bivouac, but continued to climb as separate teams. By now, they were higher on the north face than anyone had been before. They crossed the third ice field and onto the ramp. As they reached the Traverse of the Gods, they decided to join forces and climb on together. As they reached the great hanging ice field of the White Spider, the inevitable Eiger storm hit.
Heckmeyer and Ferg shouted to us, we move into the spider, there we find a safe place, you follow us. Heckmeyer, he went up an absolutely vertical crack. They disappeared above us and it took hours and hours and they didn't call for us to continue. And suddenly blood and snow came down on me and they shouted above us and Heckmeyer, he crashed down onto Ferg. And Ferg was vertically underneath him. Ferg put up his hands and he jumped with the crampons right into the hands of Ferg. So blood came out, some of the sinews were actually cut. Later on I heard the story, of course, and Ferg had a bottle given to him by a doctor, and this bottle said, take only 10 drops, but you know, Ferg was absolutely pale in his face, so Heckmeyer poured half the bottle into his mouth, and then he said so nicely to me, the other half I drank myself because I was so thirsty, he said to me.
The bottle is thought to have contained strong amphetamines.
Kasperek was about 30 feet above me, and then he shouted at me, an avalanche is coming. And so I just pressed my body towards the ice slope and I had just time to push my rucksack above my head, and that saved really my life. And now one avalanche after the other came across me and I thought, well, I'm the only one who survived now, because I couldn't imagine that anybody above me could have withstood that force of that avalanche.
The 4 climbers, they made it to the top. And as Heckmeyer said to me 60, 70 years later when he was an old man, I was actually pleased there was that storm, because it wasn't a walkover. We had to fight, we had to struggle. And that struggle through the exit cracks was astounding. It was a brilliant, brilliant achievement by any standards, a brilliant achievement. And as they came down the west flank late in the afternoon, they got down to Kleine Scheidegg, and the whole press of Europe was there to meet them. So instant fame for the 4 of them. And there's that wonderful photo of the 4 of them, and you can just see that radiant glow of fulfillment and happiness on their faces. It's a wonderful picture.
But not everyone was delighted.
You couldn't read a lot about it in the English press, you know, and there was still sort of resentment. Of course, because of the political development in Germany, the German climbers were not really very popular, of course, you know, because everyone thought that they had been directed to the wall through the Nazi party, which wasn't the case.
I think Harrer had the swastika flag in his backpack, but he didn't took it out on the summit. I think they just were glad to be on the summit. No swastika flag, no picture, no nothing. Just, Jesus, let's go down.
It was instantly politicised, because no sooner they got down to Grindelwald than they whisked off back to Germany. They were taken to the Olympic Stadium in Breslau, and there they were paraded in front of the adoring crowds, The Führer, no less, came to meet them, and they were national heroes. Here was this perfect example of the prime of Germanic manhood, achieving glory on the ultimate alpine climb. It was a spin doctor's dream handed to him on a plate.
The story of the 38 Ascent has assumed the power of myth. 4 young heroes taking on an evil ogre, overcoming huge odds, taking a magic potion that gives them the power to defeat the monster. Heinrich Harrer went on to lead an extraordinary life as a climber, explorer, writer and filmmaker. Allegations of Nazism followed him throughout his life, but his account of the climb, The White Spider, remains one of the most important pieces of mountain literature ever written. The very public success of Vogt, Kasperek, Harrer and Heckmeyer did little to diminish the power of the Eiger. It unlocked the door to a host of young, ambitious and highly skilled guides, eager to prove their worth and claim the ultimate alpine prize for their nation. The next 2 decades would see a further 30 successful ascents. But for every successful season, it seemed that the Eiger must exact a price. Death, disaster and controversy continued to dog the North Face. By the end of the 50s, it was no longer enough to climb the Heckmeyer Classic. The first solo attempt was made, and a remarkable winter ascent in 1961 in the most severe conditions. But there had still been no British ascent of the Eiger. Now, a new wave of highly skilled British rock and ice climbers were turning their attentions back to the Alps. By the time a 20-year-old Chris Bonington arrived in Grindelwald in 1957, the North Face had been climbed successfully 12 times and claimed 14 lives. It was the start of a long association with the Eiger's North Face. In July 1962, Bonington attempted the Eiger with legendary British climber Don Willans.
I wanted to climb the north wall of the Eiger. I was fascinated by it, as was Don. Probably, I would say, in 1961-62, Don was at the absolute height of his powers. I mean, he was one of the best climbers in the world at that time. But much more than that, he had the best kind of mountain judgment, feel for a mountain, of anyone that I've ever met. I mean, he was streets ahead of me. I mean, he was more experienced than I was anyway, but he was very thoughtful about his climbing, very focused about it. And he thought through absolutely everything. And on a mountain, you just couldn't have a better partner. I mean, you knew he would never, ever let anyone down.
At the same time, there was another strong British team on the face, Brian Nally and Barry Brewster.
It was a race, you know, amongst British climbers to be the first to get there. We'd gone up, the conditions were obviously wrong. It was much too warm, there was water pouring down, there was a huge amount of stonefall. And we went up to the beginning of the second ice field just to have a look. And we were only going to have a look, and we'd already planned to turn back. And just as we were about to turn back, these Swiss guides came up behind us and shouted up to us saying, 2 of your comrades are in trouble at the end of the second icefall. Will you help us to rescue them? And, you know, you don't think twice about it. We just turned around and started across the second ice field. It was very dangerous. I mean, the stone was just hurtling down around us. And then when we were about halfway across, we could see them. And then we saw this one little figure arching down the face. It was Barry Brewster. And the previous day, he'd been hit on the head by a stone. And Brian Nally managed to secure him on this little ledge at the end of the second ice field.
Brewster and Nally spent a night exposed on the North Face. In this BBC documentary, a traumatised Brian Nally takes up the story.
At first light, I tried to really make this decision. And he seemed to stir a little, moved an arm, and he seemed to regain consciousness a bit, so I went back again up the slope and got a stove, thinking that I'd make a drink or some soup or something if he could take it. And I'd started to make this, and he seemed to come to a bit. And he opened his eyes, and he seemed to know where he was and who I was. And then he said, "I'm sorry, Brian." And he died. And everything went dark, and it really was the end of everything. The first reaction was to go for the summit at any cost, because that's what we'd come to do, and I couldn't bear the thought of going down. But time passed, and I rationalised a bit more and came round to the proper decisions to make. And I took up the rope and started the long haul back.
There's a huge amount of media there were flashlights and everything else. And then when you got back to Kleine Scheidegg, there were even more. It was, you know, it was big news because it was a kind of an epic tragedy. And I think Don and I, we were kind of revolted by it. And that's why we're just very glad to escape.
Willans returned home, but Bonington stayed on in the Alps, and later that summer joined forces with British mountaineer Ian Clough.
We were at the absolute peak of our form, and Ian and I got on very well together. It was just a really good climbing partnership. And so I woke him up about 5 o'clock in the morning and said, "Look, I've had a brainwave. Let's go for the Eiger." And dear old Ian said, "Yeah, okay." And so 3 days later, we were going up the Eiger, and that time it was perfect.
Bonington and Clough had claimed the first British ascent of the Eiger's north face. Success on the Eiger changed Bonington's life forever.
Because of the Eiger, I was asked to write my first book. We had a lecture tour, had more money. It is an extraordinary face and an extraordinary climb, and got to think of what it was like in 1962 when, yeah, it was very mysterious, very challenging.
Kenton and Neil are out on the face, near the Stollenloch window, climbing part of the 1938 route.
Feel quite small all of a sudden.
It still has a real aura about it, and you set off on the Eiger quite nervously and quite anxious and wondering, am I going to be up to it? Am I going to live up to the challenge?
Wow, look at all the spindrift coming down.
Yeah, that spindrift is not looking good, is it?
It's looking horrendous.
Here comes the wind.
Straight down my neck.
You're up there and it's always dark. It's always, you know, you can see the amazing alpine meadows below you with the sun shining on them, or in the winter, you see everybody skiing in the sun and sitting in tables, eating and drinking and having a great time. But yet you're kind of in this kind of shadow land on the edge of the Eiger, really. So it isn't like a normal mountain at all, really. As is kind of, there's something there, there's something living there.
Bloody hell. Yeah, this is not North Face conditions at all.